Generally speaking, there is one type of light that photographers love to complain about, which is harsh light. That was my backpack. Harsh light. Photographers hate harsh light, like midday sun light, where the sun is like standing basically above your head, creating ugly shadows, and so on. But do you know what? Bad light does not exist. Harsh light is good light if you know how to use it. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's video, how to shoot in harsh midday light. There is a lot to go through, so I would say without further ado, let's jump into it. So first of all, we need to establish why people actually struggle to shoot in harsh light. And the first one is that they disregard the light and its direction entirely. So they might, for instance, have their subject lit by the sun while everything else is also lit by the sun, meaning that you basically have bright subject on bright background, which just completely kills contrast and leads to a probably not very compelling photo. Additionally, people tend to disregard the angle of light. And they, for instance, tend to place their subject in a way that the light just hits them in a way that, for instance, the nose is lit and that there is an ugly shadow under the nose, or that there is an ugly shadow under the eyes, which makes for raccoon eyes and is usually not that flattering to look at. And finally, and most importantly, people tend to just not shoot in harsh light enough. They're being told, yeah, harsh light sucks. So they don't shoot in it. They just go out in golden hour or in other lighting conditions that might be more compelling to what they consider good photos. And by not shooting enough in harsh light, they will also never know or learn how to shoot in these conditions. So in today's video, we're going to fix these problems. I'm going to show you how to read the light, how to find a compelling subject, how to use composition to your advantage, a few don'ts of things that you shouldn't do if you shoot in harsh light, and finally, also a few creative approaches that you can use in harsh light. So I would say, now let's get started and start with reading the light. And there is exactly 4 light reading approaches that I tend to use if I shoot in harsh light. And the first one is backlighting. And generally speaking, in harsh light, people have this horror vision that the sun is standing right above their head, creating these raccoon eyes and creating shadows under the nose. But in reality, 99% of the time, the shadow is not actually standing right above your head. Because first of all, that happens only twice a year, basically, roughly, in only regions that are situated on the equator. So anywhere else in the world, the sun will probably still stand at an angle, which has a very important implication, which is that you can actually backlight your scene. So by turning your subject in a way that the subject's back is lit by the sun and the face is in shadow, you make sure that there is even lighting on the face, which is compelling because there's no distracting light patches somewhere and no distracting shadows on the face. Additionally, by backlighting, there is actually some sun that's bouncing off the ground in front of your subject, lighting up the face and diffusing the light, which means that you can actually create some nice backlit portraits even in harsh light. So backlighting is the first and most straightforward technique that I use in harsh light. The next light reading approach is to use patches of light. Now that we have established that the sun is actually never right above your head and it actually throws a shadow, that also means that there will be shadowy parts and patches of light where the light just hits a very specific area of your scene that you can use by letting a subject walk through that bright area, therefore the subject being lit by the sun while everything else is not lit by the sun, therefore making your subject stand out. One thing you need to pay attention to when you shoot these light patches is that there is no conflicting light patches in your frame. This is super important because every other light patch will distract the viewer's attention away from the light patch you want them to look at and away from your subject. So try to avoid or reframe the composition in a way that competing light patches are not in the frame. The next light reading technique is called from brightness to darkness. And generally speaking, when photographers talk about reading the light, what they effectively mean is that they use the light to create contrast between your subject and the background. And that's exactly what we do when we, the photographers, shoot from a bright area, so we are hit by the sun, into a dark area. Because what we use is we use this shadowy dark area as a backdrop and we wait for a subject to walk through. And for this technique from brightness to darkness, it is super important that your subject is actually lit by the light, because otherwise if your person is in shadow too, you have your background in shadow, your person in shadow, and therefore there is no contrast in the scene. So really make sure that you use this shadowy area as the backdrop while your subject is lit by the sun. This photo here, for instance, is taken in Zagreb, Croatia, and you have this guy walking into the shadowy area. And I shot a burst to really capture the moment where he is last lit by the sun before moving into the shadow. And also, his hat is really, really eye-catching here, so look for something interesting on your subject, but that's something we'll talk about in a later point in the video. Another important aspect here is that you underexpose your photo, or in other words, you expose for the highlights, because by bringing down the exposure, you first of all make sure that your highlights are properly exposed, but you also make sure that these shadowy areas are very, very dark, and therefore everything in detail in these shadows is so dark that it's undistracting and not visible to the viewer. So make sure to underexpose these photos and really embrace the natural contrast in the harsh midday scene. And the next light reading approach is actually reversed, because now we shoot from shadow into the light. This approach of shooting from a dark shadowy area into brightness is very suitable if you have, for instance, a courtyard and you shoot towards the exit of that courtyard into the street that is lit by the sun. So in this case here, for instance, we are standing in a courtyard and we are shooting towards the exit of that courtyard. And as you can see, our subject is standing out because of this huge brightness difference between the harsh light outside of the courtyard and the darkness inside this courtyard. And that creates a silhouette, therefore making your subject stand out. But you can also wait until your subject is actually outside of the courtyard, therefore already hit by the light, and now the subject is still standing out, but it is now lit, and therefore you can actually see what the person looks like. Or similarly here, for instance, we are shooting at the Dutch station of Schiedam, kind regards to my Dutch viewers at this point, and we are shooting towards the light outside of the station building that is in shadow, and this person walking towards the light actually creates these silhouettes. And generally speaking, a good photo is composed of 3 ingredients. The first one is lighting. We have now talked about 4 different lighting approaches that we can use in harsh light to make our subject stand out. But the other ingredients of a good photo is that you have a good composition and that you have a great subject. So let's talk about composition next. And for harsh light, all composition rules that you would also use for golden hour light or dual light or whatever kind of light, you can also use during harsh light. But there is one composition rule that I would like to point out that I actually use a lot in harsh light, which is framing. And framing has 2 advantages in hard light. First of all, it draws the viewer attention into the middle of the scene where the action is likely set to happen. And additionally, this framing element also allows you to block off distracting light patches or distracting parts of the scene that you do not want the viewer to be distracted by. So by placing a framing element in front of a distracting scene, you can actually make sure that this distraction is totally gone. So framing is something I highly recommend when it comes to shooting in harsh light. And then the last key ingredient of a great photo is that you have a strong subject. So instead of photographing some random tourist, try to photograph something that is a bit more special. And before I've showed you this person with a hat, for instance, that I don't know why we are drawn to hats, but I really, really love to photograph hats. And generally speaking, people who are dressed nicely, whether they are wearing a dress or something, let's say, more special than, for instance, what I'm usually wearing, which is kind of boring. But look for something interesting because it really draws the viewer's attention. And now that we've talked about every element of a good composition in harsh light, from the light to the composition to an interesting subject, let's talk about a few creative approaches. And the first one is to shoot reflections. And generally speaking, people tend to just hold their camera towards a building, for instance, they want to photograph. But generally speaking, that makes for a very unspectacular and not very special photo. So how about you, for instance, look for a reflection of that building in a shop window and you take the photo. Or for instance, you take a reflection from a puddle and you take the photo. The next approach is to use longer exposures. And since we're shooting in the middle of the day and the light is super bright, super harsh, it is actually hard to get shutter speed slow enough to actually shoot long exposures. So in order to meet a shutter speed of, let's say, 1/60th or a 30th of a second that would qualify as a longer exposures, you'll first have to stop down your aperture quite a bit, so to f16 or f22, or alternatively, you use an ND filter that you place in front of the camera, or in the case of an X106, for instance, you actually just press the button to enable the built-in ND filter of your camera. And then you can, for instance, do a panning shot where you use your camera and try to move your camera in the speed of your subject, and that will lead to the background being motion blurred, but your subject being nice and crisp, like this photo here, for instance, that I've taken at Lake Bled. And the final creative approach is to shoot in black and white, because generally if we have like these super high contrast between bright highlights and very dark shadows, embrace this contrast and shoot in black and white, which means that the viewer is not distracted by color in your photo, and it also really draws the viewer's attention to the place in your photo that is the most contrasty. And this is actually also really good leeway into don'ts, or things that you should absolutely not do when you shoot in harsh light. And the don'ts come mostly down to the way you expose the scene. First, if you shoot light patches in narrow alleys, expose for the highlights, or in other words, underexpose, because if you bring up the shadows too much, all the distractions in these shadows will come out and your photo might not be as powerful. However, and this might sound a bit contradicting, but if you shoot broader landscapes or cityscapes, I found that bringing up the shadows would lead to better results, as it reduces the harshness of the light and will make your images appear softer. Additionally, while editing, do not try to mimic golden hour, because it simply isn't. And it can look very unrealistic if you warm up harsh light photos too much. So I hope that this video made you a bit more confident when shooting in harsh light. And if you're still struggling with harsh light, which is totally fair, then just sit down somewhere, have a coffee, and just wait until the light gets a bit softer. And one lighting technique that you can use when the light gets softer is backlighting. And I've made an entire video on backlighting too, which you can check out here. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in and sticking till the end. And I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.